Thank you all. Paul, thank you very much for. So this panel is on kind of research needs. And what areas do we have lacking in research that could help decision makers get a better understanding of the situation of migration and refugee displaced person environment. So it would be led by Professor Paul Hauser, who's the head of the Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities and also a distinguished hydrographer. So over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. So just to be specific, this panel is on research shortfalls that prevent decision makers from getting more effective decision support, and it covers all kinds of things: data science, climate, sensors, social science, narrative and storytelling, conflict resolution, decision support systems, et cetera. A couple of us are going to talk about water because that's our expertise. But I'm just going to give the floor to each person going down the row to introduce themselves, and I'm going to finish up with some presentation materials, and then we'll open a discussion.
Okay. Good afternoon, after lunch, everyone. As Paul said, some of us will talk about water, and I'm one of the individuals that will. Just to put things in perspective so you sort of know where I'm coming from talking about water. I did spend 26 years in government, over 20 of those years with an environmental protection agency at the state level and EPA, and then 16 years at Microsoft before I joined TrueElements, which is a water intelligence company. So TrueElements enabled me to bring my many years of government environmental protection experience together with my Microsoft experience to try to deliver a water decision support system that makes it easier for people to make decisions about all the complex issues around water. So, I guess it was 2 years ago, the UN conference, or the United Nations held only the second UN conference on water in about 40 years. And at that conference, a common refrain was, there's no humanity without water. There's no business without water. And just this week, I read a title that said, there is no data without water. And of course, that alludes to all of the efforts that are going into building data centers around the world and the amount of water that's needed. So I think what you're going to hear woven through our conversation here is the importance, at least for me, of water and data and research, right? Because all these things go hand in hand if we're going to understand some of the most complex issues in the world around resiliency. And you've been talking about resiliency as it regards migrations, but the issue of resiliency in communication and communities is probably one of the biggest issues we're facing as a world going forward. So, Paul alluded to a lot of topics this panel could cover. I don't think each one of us is going to try to cover all 8 or 9 of those that were listed. Let me just touch on 3 or 4 of them. And I'll touch on 3 of them that sort of all wind up with the last one. So data science. We are a water intelligence company, TrueElements. So what does that mean? If you think of business intelligence, right? Putting all the information on a desktop that a business leader needs to make the right decisions. That's what we're trying to do with water. So collect as much water data as we can get, curate it, make it easier to understand because water is very complex, geospatially enable it, again, make it easier to understand red, yellow, green, scores, things like that, and then use it to understand current conditions and future conditions. So that's where a lot of the artificial intelligence comes in terms of filling some data gaps and making predictions. But data science, the one thing I want to say if we want to talk about research needs and some of the gaps in research, what's going to happen when a lot of the federal data that we're accustomed to seeing today goes away? So researchers today are using that data, but how are we going to fill that data gap when important data from NOAA, for instance, regarding weather goes away? Where do we start to fill the research to fill those data gaps? And that'll lead me into a couple of other topics. The second is around climate science. So again, we're a water intelligence company. It really is based on climate science. One of the reasons I joined TrueElements is because of, again, I spent almost 20 years in environmental protection before Microsoft, but anytime somebody talked about climate change and community resilience, and climate change in particular, it was usually greenhouse gas emissions and carbon, and companies wanting to be carbon neutral. It was carbon, carbon, carbon. Only about 3% of all climate technology funds go into water. And yet 90%, you probably all know this, of the impacts of climate change are water related. 90% of climate change is water related. Drought, flooding, sea level rise, riverine rise, water quality impacts from all these other issues, extreme weather events, 1,000-year storms that are now happening 3 and 4 and 5 times a year, billions of dollars in disasters. We talked about it. Zoe did an amazing job this morning talking about what was happening in Asheville, North Carolina, and the impacts, right, of extreme weather. So how do we make sure, from a climate science perspective, we're doing the research and getting the data we need to really understand localized impacts? Because so much of climate models that you see today are based on large swaths of geography. If you look at a lot of the global data, you're going to see climate impacts by countries. Here in the US, the National Climate Change Report is based on counties. We need research on the localized impacts, hyperlocal data. The third thing I'll talk about, sensors and technology. So from a water quality perspective, there aren't enough sensors out there to really understand, for instance, water quality. So how can we invest in the technology that really brings down the cost to have the sensors that we need? And these could be water quality sensors, they could be air quality sensors, they could be weather sensors, and things like, okay, if the NOAA data is going away, what would hyper-local weather stations start to look like? And how could we get those down at a neighborhood level, right, at a community level? Because that's how we really need to understand what's happening in terms of our communities with hyperlocal data and technology that will be cheap enough to be deployed at a hyperlocal level. So that kind of research for that kind of technology. So 3 things I touched on: data science, climate science, sensors and technologies. All, for me, wrap up into a decision support system. Right? We're going to talk about some other important issues like storytelling and others, but we need to ultimately create the systems for people to make the best possible decisions. And that's not just decision makers with companies or government agencies or other organizations, but decisions have to be made by individuals. There's one thing, I'll just finish by, last week was Jane Goodall's 91st birthday, and I had the opportunity to work with her when I was at Microsoft. And one of the things she's most famous for is really articulating individual action. So that's what in the future is, how do we do the research that gets this kind of study out of the ivory towers, no offense to the universities, but out of the corporations, and start to get it into the hands of every single person in this room and every consumer so they can make the best possible decisions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kim. That was great. I'm Jim Baldo. I'm an associate professor here at George Mason University, and I'm the director of the Data Analytics Engineering program. Prior to coming to the university back in the fall of 2018, I spent 40 plus years in industry, so primarily with DoD and the intel communities. And then I spent about 14 years at Oracle. So I've been a generalist all my career, and so I'm going to try and I'm the generalist on the panel. So with respect to decision support and data, when I was asked to be on the panel, I thought about this for quite a while, and I wanted to distill this down into 5 things that I think are interlinked. They're issues that we need to address with data and decision support. And this is all sort of under this umbrella of data, its availability, its usability, and its alignment for decision support systems. So the first thing is looking at a misalignment between data and decision needs. So when you're doing research and you need data, or you have to collect data for compliance, those are different things than when you may need data, when you have to align it for decision support systems. So that was number one. The other thing that I thought about was the contextual metadata and provenance that you need for data. And so when you collect data and someone is going to use it, like for example, in some sort of the context that Kim was talking about, you definitely want to know how to describe it. You want to understand where it comes from, how it's been transformed over time. So that's a very important piece. Then also, a lot of data today is fragmented and it's in silos. And I think Kim implied that it's very difficult to get at some of this data. And if you can't get at the data, or if you lose access to it, the availability aspect of it, it can basically prevent you from making any sort of decisions, critical decisions that you need to make. Also, I'll say this, but I'll pull back a little bit from it. I think a lot of folks in the community feel that we have moved now more towards we have this sort of data layer, and people feel that there's been this underinvestment in the data layer. And I would agree with that statement. However, to move forward, I think we have to sort of figure out alternative ways to get around the investment aspect. And maybe this is more of a community approach. And I think that, by the way, I think it's a viable way to approach that problem with funding. And then, this has been mentioned numerous times today by a number of folks, is the lack of inclusion in data generation of those folks who are actually out there visiting the places where disasters are occurring, where people are having to move, suffering from diseases and things like that. Those folks need to be part of helping specifying what data we need to collect. And if we don't do that, it'll make it much more difficult to get the high data quality that we need. So I do want to end on some needs here. And I think one of the important things that we need to do from a general perspective with data is called data literacy. So we need to make sure that everybody is educated on what data is, how it's used, how you can be involved, and how you can participate with it. I also think that we need to focus on this aspect of fit for decision making, data fit for decision making. I think we need to sort of enhance that thought with respect to data in itself. And one last thing, and this is, I think, a very important aspect from me, is that when I go to a library, I have some way. In the olden days, I would go to a card catalog, physical card catalog. Now I can search and discover online. When we go to look for data, we sort of need a data catalog. And I think that to be able to stand up a data catalog that people can search, they can discover data, is a very, very important thing. And it has to be specific to the domains that we're working in. So if you take something like climate, it has subdomains, sub-subdomains. I don't think we have the answer yet for how we're going to really build these things out or how this is going to be supported. But it's a very, very critical aspect of being able to build that type of a catalog and make it accessible to everyone. And with that, I will stop and hand the baton over to.
Thank you. Hi, for those of you who weren't here this morning, my name is Lisa Gilman. I am a professor of folklore here at George Mason University, also a fellow at the dissolving Wilson Center in the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative, and I'll be the director of the Institute for Immigration Research here at Mason in the fall. I'm coming at this from a completely different angle. I love that there's a folklorist on the panel. Thank you, Lynn. So I'm an ethnographer. I do research on the ground, very immersive type of research where I live with people, hang out with people, I also do some interviews, and really focused on that, what was the localized impact. I'm there with people and am getting that, really understanding the localized impact in ways that's really difficult to do with kind of larger data gathering projects. And I'm a real believer that we need all of that. I think sometimes we have the qualitative versus quantitative fights, and I think that's ridiculous. I think we need all of it. And we also need to be talking to each other more, because I think there's value in different kinds of research, and also in different ways of getting making that research accessible, whether we're having data sets that you can go and access it through online research programs, or whether it's being shared through storytelling in more public settings, whether it's in policy briefs. There's a lot of different ways that data needs to get out to the general public, to people in our own fields, to people across fields, to decision makers, et cetera. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the importance of the stories of real life people and the need for gathering those stories, but also for making them public. And actually, I think, totally forgetting your name, Cindy. No, next to Cindy. Yes. Zoe, so sorry. Zoe's presentation this morning, where she used one person's story as a way to illustrate a huge set of issues and problems and solutions, was really impactful. And I think it speaks to that need for storytelling as a way to really bring light to what's going on in a situation, how to make that public, how to talk about what needs to be done, what could be done, what's already happening. I think all of that gets encapsulated in the story in a way that throwing out statistics like 5 million people did this and 300,000 did that. You're like, I don't know. I don't understand what that is. But then when you meet a real human being, or you hear a real human being's story, it often can really change how you think about something in a really profound way. And as somebody who does research with refugees, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been talking to somebody and they'll say to me, well, I'm just a human being like you. And I'm like, yeah. Why are you telling me this? No, I'm just a human being. Like I'm a human being. I'm like, yeah, why are you telling me this? And I'd be like, oh, wait a minute. People are not treating them like a human being. They're just like, they just feel like they're being erased or ignored or kind of assumptions about them that have nothing to do with them as their existence. And they're like, so my project is like, hey, I want to interview you and write your stories so people can learn about who you are as a human. And they're like, yes, please. Like, I want other people to know me as a human being, which is like such a simple thing, but is so important. And so, and I'm thinking about like climate change and refugees, and like one of the things that I've experienced and just the research that I'm doing is, and I'll give you two stories, so this is about the value of stories, is that there's people that I met in, 2021 in the city in Turkey near the Syrian border, in Gaziantep, Antakya, Adana. And I was literally supposed to give a virtual talk to a university in Adana one morning, and I was like, I don't really want to get up to do this really early because of the time difference. I get up and there's a text message, Lisa, the conference has been canceled. I'm like, oh, thank goodness. I didn't want to give that talk anyway. And it's like, oh, because an earthquake just hit. And then I'm like, oh, wait. And then the next thing I know, I'm texting Syrian refugees living in Turkey. I'm like, are you okay? And Nadir, this young man, sends me a picture from his phone of him in the middle of rubble and tells me they're searching for people and it's freezing. And so he's a displaced Syrian in Turkey, and now the earthquake has devastated the city he's in, and he's with his family, and they're all these people that fled war are now being killed or dying from the earthquake or are in this displaced and horrendous situation. And if I hadn't been there that summer and wasn't interacting with that person, I would have been like, and wasn't supposed to give a talk that day, I would have been like, there was an earthquake in Turkey. There's always these earthquakes happening all over the world. But because I knew the person and had that story, I was like, oh, wait, there's an earthquake in Turkey. I can't function anymore. This is really real. And that story was like, oh, wait, displacement by war is connected to displacement by climate change, and all of these things are like packed on top of each other. And I personally understood that in a way that I wouldn't have without the connection to those human beings and the ability to hear those stories. And I'm sharing that story to you now so that you'll probably leave with like, oh, wait, the war and climate change or climate crises are happening, are impacted. So I don't remember what I was going to say. I just started telling a story because a story has power. So stories have power. Stories are really important for humanizing people. They're really important for showing the kind of nuance and diversity of human experience. Stories are really important for assessing what needs to be done, finding out from people what's really going on. They are important for finding out in the refugee situation why people left, why they can't go back. I mean, how many times I've heard people say, why don't all the Syrians go back? They just don't know. And if you just talk to a few Syrians and get their stories, you'll be like, oh, right, they really can't go back. And that might change your attitude or policy or other things. Stories are also really important for community building and peacemaking. It is through then conflict resolution, right? It's through people connecting with one another, learning about one another, sharing those stories that you start to find commonality or understanding or finding out where the conflict is and what it is that needs to be resolved. Really learning about the negative impacts of various things. You hear that, through stories. And again, it's really easy when you hear negative things are happening, it's very easy to compartmentalize it and put it away. And like, I can't deal with that, that's hard emotionally. But stories gives you a way to make it real, to acknowledge it. Think about how it connects to who you are, both just in terms of your own emotional experience or people you might know. And also something that I'm really focused on is joy and pleasure, and I focus on the arts and culture and resilience and agency, and recognizing that even people that are really negatively impacted by things that are happening in the world are still humans who sing. I use I talked about flirtation in a recent conference presentation, and the audience really grabbed onto that. I was talking about like people fleeing war who are like, oh, you're kind of cute, and then they're like, they fall in love and they make babies and they have weddings and they dance, and it's like you don't think about that with people who are in really precarious situations, but that's a really big part of being human, and you see that wherever you go. And so again, that helps you understand people as just human beings, right? And that should be impacting all sorts of things. So I think I'm going to, and I was really excited to be at the Wilson Center, and I'm really, really sad that it has been, is being shut down. But my colleague who started the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative, Jean-Thon Majuk, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, he started that initiative with the basis that lived experience should inform policy. And I think that, that's a really important, idea that we need to be really thinking about. And then how do you do that research? How do you make that research available for policymakers? So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually going to show some slides, but I wanted to respond real quick. I'm going to show some slides, hopefully, about storytelling in the water sector. When Lynn asked me to do this, I thought about wicked water problems, and I've encountered a number of them over my career, and I wanted to share a few of those. But before I started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the research, the science of water, the stuff that I do. We rely on data. We want to find the water balance is a big part of doing water research. So we want to know how much water comes into a system, how much is stored in it, and how much flows out of it. And believe it or not, in order to find that water balance information, we have to go to 17 different federal agencies. So the U.S. Geological Survey collects data on river flow, and NOAA collects data on precipitation, and the Department of Agriculture collects information on snowpack, and on and on and on. NASA collects a lot of ancillary information, maps of all those things. But in order to tell the full story, we have to get data that's fragmented from across the government and across governments around the world, and data availability is very difficult. We've had a luxury of having that in the United States, which is fragmenting. But in other countries, there's, I've encountered in Africa where one agency will sell data to its sister agency to make money. I've seen where there's complete embargoes by countries not, sharing any of their data. So there's all kinds of interesting data problems that we could talk about. But let me get into this international water research issues. Water is really important. There's a lot of water on Earth. This is a little diagram down here, but 97.5% is in the ocean. And then of the fresh water, about 70% is locked up in snow and ice, the other in groundwater, and there's a little teeny sliver here that's fresh water that we access. So when you try to understand a water cycle and try to measure water availability, you're measuring a very, very tiny fraction of the water on Earth. And whenever you're trying to measure a tiny fraction of something, you have to be pretty precise, and it's hard to get it that accurate. So a little bit about water in the global scale. There's really 4 things about water that are very special. So water exists in all 3 phases, liquid, solid, and gas. And phase transitions, just transitioning from one phase to another, transfers gigantic amounts of energy. So you think about water regulates climate, big time. Water vapor, believe it or not, is also the principal most important greenhouse gas. If you look at any absorption spectrum, you'll see that water vapor is across the board. CO2 is in a few specific places. But we're actively changing CO2, carbon dioxide. We're not trying to actively change water vapor, but it changes anyway because a warmer climate, warmer atmosphere absorbs more water and will have more greenhouse gas, so it's a positive feedback loop. Water is also the ultimate solvent. It regulates biogeochemical cycles and element cycles. It moves stuff around, and that's a big impact on the carbon cycle. And water directly impacts and constrains human beings and its well-being. So if you look at where we live next to rivers, next to oceans. It's a big impact on us when those things change. So water is connected in climate to the environment, to water supply and air quality, and of course for consumption. The consequences of climate change, which was already mentioned, really come through the water cycle. This is really hard to read. These are just big disasters around the world, and I've circled all of them that are water. These are the top most costly disasters in the world since 1900, and water is almost in every one of them. Now, it might be a cyclone, it might be, like the top one on there is Chernobyl disaster, contamination of water and the surrounding areas. So now I want to get into some of the storytelling that I want to say about the big disasters I've seen. So one of them has to do with groundwater. So this is a picture of the Ogallala, the Great Plains Aquifer that goes from South Dakota down into Texas. It used to be artesian. It actually, you could drill a hole in the ground and water would just come out. Now you have to pump it hundreds of feet out of the ground. And we're actively depleting this aquifer. But this isn't the only aquifer that we're depleting. In the United States, we are depleting almost all of our aquifers. So you think that a lot of these issues are third world or African kind of issues, and there are. If you look around the world, there are similar issues all around the world, but we are actively mining our groundwater across the United States. And these are just a few places. It's well known in California. There's land subsidence, but all across the southern United States, we have depletion of groundwater and land subsidence occurring because of it. That's not repairable. You can't just put water back in and the land pops back up. It's a permanent subsidence because of the water being extracted. If we look at it globally, aquifers around the world, we see global declines in aquifers all over the world. So, you know, we're not sustainable. We're not sustainable with water. We're actively mining it everywhere around the world. And, you know, eventually we're going to have to reconcile that. The next issue, we are killing some of our inland seas. This is the Aral Sea in Midwest, the mid part of Asia, and through diversions for agriculture, this sea has virtually vanished. And with it, the climate has changed. So there was precipitation recycling that occurred. Evaporation from the lake would spur precipitation in that region. It's pretty much completely dried up, and we're left with a desert in that area. We're seeing, I'm going to not go there yet. We're seeing similar issues with the Great Salt Lake. We're seeing similar issues with the Dead Sea, which I will talk about because I worked there as well. So I got the interesting privilege of working in the Bay Delta region about 10 years ago to do with a little fish called the Delta smelt. So the Bay Delta, San Francisco Bay, is a pretty complicated system. The Sacramento River feeding it from the north, the San Joaquin from the east, and there was a large area of wetlands that have mostly been drained and made into agricultural areas. But what's interesting is there's some large hydro projects like Shasta Dam on the Sacramento River and the California Aqueduct, and there's a federal aqueduct that bring water from this area to the south, to agricultural areas and to 30 million thirsty people in Southern California. Some of these rivers end up flowing backwards because the pumps are pulling water from the system and the fish get confused. Where do we go now? So this little Delta smelt was the thing that caused me a problem when I was investigating this for the Bureau of Reclamation, is that the Delta smelt is an endangered species in this Bay Delta area, and it breeds in a very specific set of temperatures and salinity factors in the brackish water of the Delta, and when that brackish water changes, it can be detrimental to the endangered species. We have strong endangered species laws that basically say, you know, we need to give water to the in-stream uses like the fisheries. One of the things that was interesting when I was there is they were proposing developing a new tunnel, one of the largest water projects in the country. I think they're still trying to do this 10 years later, but they want to try to isolate this system by bringing water across the wetlands and delivering it right to the pump stations. Another big, interesting issue that I got to work on is the Colorado River Basin. I actually went to school in Tucson and got exposed to this big time. This is me fishing in the upper Colorado, a picture I took of Hoover Dam when I did a tour there. And I've done a lot of research on the upper Colorado Basin with snow research. But the Colorado Basin is in incredible decline of water resources, governed by laws that were created over 100 years ago that overestimated the amount of water that was available, and some large water projects delivering water to Southern California as well as to Phoenix and Tucson pretty much make the water that reaches the southern border almost zero. We do have a treaty with Mexico that we have to give them a certain amount, 1.5 million acre feet per year, but they use that for agriculture, and it really doesn't reach the ocean. So water is used, they say, about 7 times that gets pumped, used for irrigation, it flows back into the river before it reaches Mexico. Of course, great landmarks like the Grand Canyon are part of this system. This is Hoover Dam, just a snapshot of what we are seeing in this area. 1983 was the last time this dam was full. And over the course of the last few decades, it has declined to about half of its capacity or less. And the lake has shrunk. This is the water levels over time. And it's, occasionally we get a good water year and it gets propped up, but it might take 20 good water years in a row in order to fill this back up. So, we continue to drain this by treaty. Las Vegas is allocated a certain amount of water, and they built a $1 billion project to put a pipe right in the bottom of this dam so they can drain every last drop out of it. So, yeah, these are wicked water problems. These are things that won't easily be solved, and we're having a reckoning with them. We're gonna run out of water in these areas. Here's a example of what they used to call, they think it was called the Garden of Eden in southern Iraq in 1973. This is a false color composite, meaning red means vegetation. And if you look in 2000, and I tried to find a picture after this and I haven't found one, but this large area of vegetation is basically gone for the same reason as some of the inland seas is diversions. So diversions for agriculture just have taken the water from the Euphrates and the Tigris to use for other things. Also, there's a lot of interesting cross-border upstream uses. So if you look at the Tigris and Euphrates, you have them originating mostly in Turkey. Turkey has been in an active dam building campaign, as has Syria, and so with those dam completions, there's been a decrease in the overall water in the Tigris and Euphrates. It turns out that there's a wide number of international river basins around the world where international transboundary river disputes are rampant. And wars have been fought over this, especially in the Middle East. But even in the United States, we have this. So I did a project on the Columbia River Basin where I grew up in Portland, Oregon. How much water is stored on the Columbia? It seems like it's a simple question. There's a bunch of dams on the Columbia like Grand Coulee and Bonneville. It turns out there's 26 different federal, state, tribe, and private groups that manage dams on that river, and they don't share data. So it's difficult to know how much water is stored or when it's been released from dams in Canada, and even the federal agencies, the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation, don't really know how much water they store on those systems. This is an example. I got the privilege of working in the Dead Sea. I actually worked on this canal. This is the King Abdullah Canal. It brings water from basically the Jordan River into the agricultural breadbasket of Jordan, which is just upstream from the Dead Sea. And it's about 50 years old and has all kinds of leaks and damage. They were trying to decide whether they should put this in a pipe or not, so they hired me to figure out how much water is lost. And we figured out about half of the water that gets pumped into this thing is just lost. It's not used for agriculture. It evaporates, or it's stolen, or it seeps into the ground from leaks. But systematically, the Dead Sea, while it probably won't disappear, is dropping about 1 meter per year. So when I was there working, there was a lot of talk about this. They called it the Red Dead Project. It was one of the largest projects ever proposed for water in the world, and they were going to take water from the Red Sea, which is part of the ocean, and bring it over a hill and down to the Dead Sea, which is about 1,000 feet below sea level. In the process, creating hydropower, desalination opportunities, bringing water to Amman and maybe parts of Israel. And I just read, I was very sad, that project died a few years ago because of lack of interest by Israel. So, moving on from that, Superfund sites, EPA. So we have Superfund sites, 1,300 active Superfund sites across the United States. These are not simple problems. These are problems that will be with us in some cases for tens of thousands of years. I passed one, I was on a trip, driving trip over spring break home from Phoenix, and stopped in well, I thought I was gonna stop in a ghost town in New Mexico. It turned out it was the second largest release of radioactivity in the world. I didn't even know this. Second to Chernobyl, which is just east of Albuquerque. And I couldn't stop because there were signs that said you can't stop here. But those kinds of things, radioactivity of that magnitude, will be with us for 10,000 years. This isn't a problem we can just clean up tomorrow or throw money at. And in addition, we're cutting these things. So there are all of these places all over the country with horrible conditions, and there's currently an effort to cut another 3,000 jobs from the EPA, as well as about 30 or 40% of the funding for these things. It's well known that our current president isn't a fan of EPA. Okay, so I just gave you a little tour of things that I've been involved in with wicked water problems. There's a lot of them. These are just a couple of them. How do we solve these things? That's what we're here for. That's why we don't want to just talk about how bad it is. What do we do about this? And it's possible there isn't a solution. It's possible that they might be things we just have to learn to live with. They might be with us a long time. They also involve more than science, more than research. So there's a lot of contradictory ideas about how to solve them. There may be no right or wrong solutions, only better or worse conditions. So one of the issues with the Colorado River is that if you renegotiate the treaty, that means everybody gets less water. And nobody wants that, so why renegotiate it? But sometimes getting the right answer can be less important than being in agreement with what to do next. So coping rather than solving. And there's no simple solutions to a lot of these things. And you can't solve them in isolation. It's possible that some action you take to solve a problem, one of these big problems, will end up having another problem somewhere else. So last slide. Wicked problems in general, and that's not just water, have common definitions. There's incomplete or contradictory knowledge. We don't really fully understand them. There's a whole lot of people involved with different opinions. There's a large economic burden to resolve it. And they're interconnected with other problems, so interventions could impact something else. Possible solutions: some kind of cooperative mechanism that functions properly to fix them. That's the case with the Red Dead project I was talking about in Israel and Jordan. They couldn't come up with a cooperative mechanism, so the thing died. It was a great idea. It had huge potential for economic and environmental positive impacts, but they couldn't agree on it. There's got to be trust and mutual respect amongst the parties, involvements of key stakeholders. I'm not saying much about research here because solving these problems transcends research. Good communication, interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary collaboration and perseverance. We need new kinds of reasoning, persistence and patience, sharing experience and lessons learned. And this is an interesting one that I got from somebody else's slide, is eating with your partners. So having lunch and chatting about ideas is one of the best ways to solve problems. So with that, I have a few questions I was thinking of presenting to the panel. But before I do that, I wanted to ask if the panel has questions of each other and if you have questions of us, because we haven't taken any questions yet. So do you guys have questions of each other? We have about half an hour, so we got plenty of time. Anything?
So Paul, given amazing graphics there in terms of some of the work you've done in the past, as you look to the future, what are you seeing in any of those jurisdictions where people are starting to move in the right direction in terms of addressing some of these wicked problems?
Absolutely. Believe it or not, I saw really great collaboration and solutions occurring in Israel and Jordan. They trade water back and forth across their borders. They have treaties, and they honor those. And there seems to be some real cooperation for solving some of the issues. They weren't able to agree on that big Red Dead project, but they agree on a lot of other things. So there's bits of hope here and there where people actually do cooperate and find solutions to some of their issues. So you do see examples of it. Have you seen it?
My sense is, we're at a really pivotal time. And what I'm trying to figure out is, and I think the storytelling component is really important, because I think we've done a flat out miserable job with telling the story about water and telling the climate change story. Obviously, when we have so much disagreement about climate change, we're doing a really bad job around climate change. I guess what I'm looking towards the future is, if we don't use the word climate change, we at least know from a storytelling perspective, individuals will recognize that they have suffered, like in Asheville, North Carolina, like with Hurricane Milton that came after it. I mean, in a touch of irony, my colleague, who Dr. Wells knows, Dr. Chuck Lewisell, was scheduled to speak in Tampa at the American Society of Civil Engineers on a topic called Rethinking the 100-Year Storm for Design Standards, when the American Society of Civil Engineers conference in Tampa was canceled because of Hurricane Milton, which came right after Helene, just a few weeks after Helene hitting the same West Coast. So I guess what I would say is, how do we start to tell the story about resilience, if we can't use the word climate change today, right? Start talking about resilience in a way that it gets to the hyper-local level, because at least people can relate to that, because it's an individual, it's a person, it's that, that person Zoe was talking about who can't get water, right? Or can't, has lost their house, or communities have lost billions of dollars. So, no, I haven't really seen good examples, and I'm just hoping, as a society, we can learn to do a better job of telling the story and getting decision makers, if they don't believe in climate change, they actually understand what's it going to do to protect our community, because humanity, our economy, everything rests on it.
I have two questions, one for Lisa, and this will be quick, is the impact on the work that you do in your area if you lose availability to data sources. And Lisa, you brought up an interesting point about culture and data. And so, whoever wants to go first.
For me. In terms of what do we do if we lose data? So, yeah, and it's starting to happen. You've seen federal data sets be taken down. So what we're doing is Paul, to your point, we bring data in from over 24 federal agencies and put it all in one place. We can give you access to that, so you can use it, so you don't have to do it yourself. But we've automated all those processes, and we're grabbing it as fast as we can. But here's where artificial intelligence will come in, because we do expect some of those data sources will go away. We will use artificial intelligence and some of our algorithms to actually predict what we think that data might show in the future based on historic patterns, but also we know the historic patterns aren't good. So we bring other things in, like the weather and the International Panel on Climate Change predictions for the future. And that's how we predict water impacts for the future. It's not based on what happened historically, because we can show you if we did it based on what happened historically, we'd be way off point. Because we're using the IPCC protocols for what climate change impacts might happen. So what I'll say is, I hope we're not going to have a long-term access without data, but we're collecting it as fast as we can. We have it. We have historic versions, so we can look at one version and the next, and we will use artificial intelligence to predict what that pattern might show in the future. And then and here's the important point, because we do it now, when we can get a real data point on something, because we're working with like water keeper chapters. So if somebody goes out and does a water quality sample, we will compare that real live water sample to what we predicted, and then our learning models will continue to learn based on the difference between what we predicted and what we have from a real live water quality sample, for instance. So that's our plan.
I'm not sure I understood your question. You were talking about can you be more specific about what I said? Remind me.
Yeah, so you provided a context where you were with the subjects, and you were not necessarily collecting quantitative data, but you were collecting data that, and I don't want to bias your answer here, but it seemed to me that there was the emotional aspect, and that I think you may have been reflective of, that may not be captured in this quantitative data, and that's missing.
Yeah, very much so, right? I mean, I think that the emotional side of it, the affective side it's important for so many different reasons. I mean, I think like on a, one is just I try to understand how human beings exist and understand their own worlds, and the emotional and the cultural is really important. I mean, when I think about water, right, I'm thinking about the cultural side of it is how are people using the water? What do they think about water? What belief systems exist around water? How do they use water in ritual? How do they use water for food and drink? What containers do they use? I mean, all of the stuff about how humans engage with water is cultural, including how do we build dams, and do we divert water, and what kind of agriculture do we do? Like, that's all culture. But somehow I think a lot of times scientists and culture people don't talk to each other to even recognize that that is culture. And so sometimes there are development efforts that are intended to meet a need, but that don't take culture into consideration, and they fail, or they don't reach I don't know if they fail is the right term, but they might not achieve their goals, not recognizing that if they'd thought about culture while they're developing the projects, that they could have worked. It could have been successful if they'd thought about the kind of the human cultural component a little bit more. In terms of the emotional side of it, I mean, if you're dealing with climate incidents or anything that causes human displacement, I mean, if you ignore the emotional side of it, I mean, we're all humans having a feeling right now, right? I mean, it's kind of a really profound thing that we do when the moment you're displaced. I mean, if right now you go home and your house has been flooded and you have to leave, you're going to have an intense emotional reaction, right? And just kind of ignoring that emotion I think allows for a lot of kind of policy making and decision making that kind of ignores the people, because you're ignoring that emotional side. It's also really important in storytelling, right? No story is you're not going to be interested in a story unless it touches you effectively, and the ones that touch you the most are more likely going to impact you in some way, whether, whatever that impact might be. So I think that, again, I think all of it is necessary, and there needs to be more interaction with the different kinds of researchers and research. I don't know. That's
I want to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys, so make sure you have something ready. This is your warning. So I want to ask Kim, I'm really interested in your mopping up all the data and bringing it into your organization. Personal observation or value that I have is I've been a big proponent of citizen science. I have inexpensive weather stations on my roof. I've installed hundreds of these in Africa and also on the GMU campuses. And I'm an advocate of sharing that data with NOAA, with one of the organizations that I was really happy with was Weather Underground. And I was quite appalled to find that Weather Underground is now offering to sell my data back to me. So I can't really get it any other way but to buy it from them. And so I wanted to get your perspective as a person from a private company and collecting all this data. What's going to happen to this in the future? You're going to have to make some money on it. How do we get it back out when we need it?
Yeah, that is a great question. So a 60-second background on my perspective and why this is really important to me personally. I mentioned I spent over 20 years in environmental protection agencies. But first of all, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm not a biologist. I'm not an engineer. My science is a political science degree. But one of the things I did very early in my career, way back in the late 90s, was in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, work with our management team, with the secretary and the deputy secretaries to say, what information do we need to collect so that we can demonstrate to the citizens of Pennsylvania that we were making an impact on the environment. We were spending tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. Were we improving the environment? Because the only indicators up till then, and those of you who are familiar with, performance metrics, no, we were counting widgets. We were counting how many permits got issued, how many enforcement actions we took, fines and penalties collected, right? So, and it's like, just because you collect more in fines and penalties every year doesn't mean you're doing a good job as an environmental protection agency. It's ludicrous. How do we measure whether the environment's getting better? So that was back in the 90s that we started doing this and measuring compliance of facilities. In fact, Tom Ridge was elected governor on this very platform. When Tom Ridge was running for governor of Pennsylvania, you know Tom Ridge from probably being Homeland Security Secretary, but he was governor of Pennsylvania. And our agency was actually a target in the campaign. But he said we should be focusing on compliance, getting companies in compliance. And when we decided to put compliance data on the website, companies would traipse through his office and say, this is terrible, 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 we shouldn't do it. And he said, oh, no, you said compliance was important and fines and penalties weren't, so we're going to measure compliance. I do this to go way back to the 90s because that's where I started in environmental protection, was looking at, is the environment getting better? And then I was the assistant administrator for the Office of Environmental Information at EPA, which is one reason it breaks my heart. It's so personal to me to see the loss of environmental data. Come full circle after Microsoft coming back here, or coming to TrueElements, I fully believed in my early days at EPA, we were actually charged under President Bush with making as much data transparent as possible. That was one of his goals. And the reason that was a goal, this was the early days of transparency, was the belief that if you make data available to the public, the private sector will innovate. And it happened. We saw this incredible work that got done using NOAA data, NASA data, right? So the fact that this is being shut down now is totally illogical to me. But for me, in those early days, I recognized that the data all too often was in the hands of government decision makers, researchers, and a small handful of people. And even when the data were made publicly available, Paul, it was like people like you that could access it, right? Researchers could access it. NGOs maybe could access it, but the general public couldn't access it. The average citizen didn't understand if you published on a website, oh, here's 100 data sets. Well, they don't know what to do with that. So here's what we're doing at TrueElements to answer your question. Yes, we are a for-profit company, and we believe there is real value in taking hundreds of data sets from around the world and make it all available in one place, because we can save engineers and people lots and lots and lots of time by finding it in one place, geospatially enabled and easy to understand. And we're charging for that because we have some of our own unique algorithms. But what we're also doing is we will make some of that data publicly available for free to the average consumer, because we want every single person to be able to understand water and check their water quality just like they check the weather every day. So we're coming out with an app this summer that will make a lot of the water data that we take that is really complex, and we make it easy to understand with scores, and we're going to make that available to the public free.
Great, thank you. I mean, it all makes sense. You're value adding, you're collecting it, you're providing a service, and you need to make a profit. To make it crystal clear on why it's important to research. So research, the scientific process starts with observation. It starts with taking real data about the world, and then it continues to understanding that data, analyzing it, finding trends, finding information in that data, then making theory and making potentially hypotheses that can be made into theory, and then testing that theory and prediction and making models of that. And then when you have all that done, then you go back and say, we don't know as much as we thought, we need more data. So it's a big circle, and you kind of go around and around, but data drives it. And not having data just kills the rest of the innovation. So it's very important. Thank you for your efforts in making sure that's preserved. Can we take some questions from the audience? Do you guys have any thoughts? Yes. We'll come around to y'all.
My name's Nick Katziotis. I've been tracking the data centers, which Kim, I see you're a Microsoft person. I've noticed that they're keeping the data hostage. Once you go into their data, for the data analytics you're talking about, to make a big change, to move the data out of Microsoft to Oracle. So my question for you specifically would be, how are the marketplace, you're with a not-for-profit or is it for-profit?
Yeah, we are a for-profit company.
Okay, all right. But I mean, I'm noticing with the federal government, once the private sector contractor, and usually there's a company between the cloud provider, like Azure or Booz Allen, and the data, these big data sets like NOAA, all these Navy weather, they get trapped in the data center, and to get it out to move it around is very costly and difficult. So they don't have a true open protocol or a multi-cloud, to move it around. So I mean, I'm just curious where this is going to go to do serious data analytics for smaller companies that don't have the budget to deal with the big data center providers.
I'm not sure, maybe you understand the question better. Well, what I would say is, like an organization like NOAA and EPA, you go right to their website and you get access to their data right from those agencies for free. There's no charge whatsoever for that data for any of the federal agencies, as long as they were publishing until they stopped publishing it. And some of the big providers, like Microsoft has a planetary computer, Google Earth, there's a lot of data you can get from them at no charge as well.
Well, I haven't researched what you're saying, the large data sets, but I don't think the public, bits and pieces like checking my water in Fairfax County, that's nothing. That's one little bit of data.
Right.
I'm talking about something larger, because the creative guys are the little guys, the little entrepreneurs, and they don't typically have the budgets.
Oh, that's what we're doing. We're a little company. There's only 12 of us.
Okay.
Yeah, we're a little entrepreneur, but we're grabbing all that data from the federal agencies and
where are you
making it easy to understand.
And where are you modeling it?
Where-
Modeling it in the cloud or
Yeah.
on-prem?
Oh, modeling it in AWS.
Okay, so you have a pretty decent-sized budget to run the models. You don't know.
No, I know. I know what our budget
I'm
is.
just
I'm the
curious,
COO. I
'cause
know what our budget is, yeah.
No, but I've been
but it's
looking
not-
at this, and I
yeah.
think that's an impediment for the creative little companies to be able to grab that and to do the modeling. It's just a curiosity, because I've seen it.
You know, so I will tell you, AWS was very good to us. I mean, we had a ton of free computer time from AWS, from Google, from Microsoft. I mean, these companies, like AWS has given us $150,000 in compute time. So they will encourage entrepreneurs. Yeah.
So real quick, I'd just like to add on to your question. I think it's a great question. I think that data is spread out all over the place right now, as you're pointing out. And just finding it is one problem. But then secondly, if you're going to have to use a large data set to address the problem that you're talking about, the large compute that you may need to do, that is a problem. And there's, I think Kim brought up some good points. You might be able to get some free resources from some of the large ISPs. But for the most part, and there's the small startups are actually the ones that are being really innovative about this, looking at unique, innovative ways to process lowering the compute, which is going to be important, because right now, you get on an airplane, you buy a ticket, they tell you what your CO2 contribution is. I think we're going to start seeing this when we go off to compute. What is the CO2 footprint that you're creating? But that being said, I think it's an open question that we're trying to resolve right now. So it's a good question, and we've got to keep our finger on that problem.
Thank you. So just as a quick follow-up to the gentleman, actually, I'd suggest you look into open source. There's a lot of open source. The open source movement, Hugging Face, actually curates a huge data set that is collected from all of these public resources, and they put it there. And they also have open source AI models. So between the data and the AI models for entrepreneurs, for researchers, et cetera, it's a huge boon, and I highly recommend you look into it. But thank you so much for the sobering presentation on water. I'm from the tech side myself, and I knew that the water problem was bad. We were talking about it over lunch, but I just didn't know how bad it was, and appreciate you kind of pointing that out. It's pretty bad. So given that we're talking about these freshwater aquifers kind of really drying up, and it's a real problem. My question is twofold. Number one, have you seen any evidence of the big tech companies that are advocating for more AI and more data centers and more energy, looking at this water problem as a potential impediment to their ability to scale their operations? Are they even paying attention to it at all? Because we know that water is going to be a major issue. And then second to that, is how effective are water desalinization plants for solving the kind of the water problem that looks like it's really, really brewing as we are running out of fresh water sources?
So for the first question about water and AI and data centers, we have a lot of data centers in this area. Water isn't really a limiting factor in Virginia, in this part of Virginia, but 50% of the water that is pumped in the United States is used to cool power plants. So it might be pumped back into the environment, but it's not necessarily consumed. But like take Lake Anna in Central Virginia, it's a cooling pond for a nuclear power plant. So that's just an example of how we use water and power kind of interchangeably. We have to, when we build power plants, there's power plants all around the Chesapeake Bay because of this reason. You need water to cool them down, or for the turn the turbines or whatever. There's also a big need to have electricity to move water. So the Central Arizona project, for example, has had a whole coal-fired power plant built for it just to move water from the Colorado River to Phoenix and Tucson. So water and power really play hand in hand. The cooling requirements of data centers, I'm not aware of the data, AI companies being that concerned about water at this point, but I do wonder why they're building so many here, high power, high cost of land and that sort of thing, but it's probably, the connectivity and the personnel and the expertise in this area.
Okay, can I just respond to
Yes,
that, maybe on
please
the
do.
data centers? I think we're starting to lose this one a little bit. I will tell you, I know the big three hypercloud companies, Google, AWS, and Microsoft, are intensely aware of their water usage. All of them have something called water positive goals. You've heard of carbon neutral. You know what carbon neutral means. Water positive means they want to return more water to a watershed than they use globally, and they're all tracking those. Google, I've been told in my conversations with them, will spend $100,000 on a project if you can document saving, I think it's 1 million gallons of water a year, which isn't that much to save. Microsoft is working with a company called Fido, and you'll see it, if you search on Fido on Microsoft, you'll see them all over the news. Fido has AI technology that will save about 30% of the water loss from utility companies from leaking, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all hyperware, and they are working like crazy to find ways to meet their replenishment goals by saving water in one place to offset the water they're using in another place.
What was the second question?
It's about the water desalination.
Oh, desalination. Yeah, desalination is a pretty mature technology that's used all over the world. We use it widely in California, in Arizona, to even desalinate salty groundwater. So it's used for municipal sources. It's used almost exclusively in Saudi Arabia, for example, but it for potable water, and but it's very costly. It's costly in the reverse osmosis membranes, the power that it takes to keep the pressures against the membranes. And it also creates a brine that's toxic. Just the salt water that comes out of the system has to be disposed of. So there's different ways to do that. But it is probably something we have to rely on more. And reuse of water, reusing wastewater, which nobody likes that idea, but it's being done in California, so it's probably going to be, if you pour it into a reservoir first and then pump it back out, maybe that's more palatable. But it's definitely something that we'll be seeing more and more of in the world. Other questions?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Michael. I'm from Uganda, but I live in this area. I've lived here over 10 years, and the last 15, 20 years, a lot of my work involves working with governments in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of West Africa, Southern Africa, deploying information systems, decision support systems, as panelists are talking about. The biggest challenge, as I listen to what we are talking about, is that some of those governments distrust, are not ready to share their data, or for one reason or another. Some reasons are genuine. For instance, I can imagine if you know how much fresh water I have in Uganda in the Nile Basin, probably 10, 15, 20 years later, you could have a president somewhere who says, now we need Uganda because everywhere else is, the water is all being used up. So how are we going to work around that, come up with, might be policies, it might be data collection that is fair, that does not disempower some of these countries, so they are willing to share that data, and obviously the compute, we're talking about compute that some of the big companies have. Many of these countries do not even have a 10% of what a private company here has to be able to run machine learning models that could be helpful to them.
That was a big question. Do you guys want to address that?
In less than 2 minutes?
Yeah.
The best that I can say is that answering the first concern that you have, the government's not willing to share their data. There's I think you used the term distrust. That is most likely going to take some time. I don't know how. I'm not. I don't deal with policy, and I think this goes at the international level, where somehow international groups would have to get involved to provide a rationale or a basis for sharing the data, and maybe there would be, the policy would provide some sort of economic benefit or some benefit back to an African nation that was hesitant about sharing their data. Maybe some technical help. We are starting to move into various privacy encryption technologies that may allow data to be protected better so that governments, organizations could share it more widely without having to lose. So they don't have to trust a country because the technology protects the data. That's coming. It's very expensive right now, but I think that might help. But I think other solutions, policy-wise, are going to be needed. In terms of acquiring computing power, as you were pointing out, because there's a disadvantage, I also think that that's a global community type of application that has to take place. It would be nice if all of a sudden we had the magic compute and we could give everybody their compute. But I think somewhere we need, and it's unfortunate, I think the situation is not, today it's a little different. We're not providing the sort of aid that a disadvantaged or a country with less resources has to build up. I think it could be solved by sharing, but that's going to take some time and some very, very smart people who understand policy to make that happen. But it's a good question. I think you hit it spot on, the problem.
It's not only a problem, it's a problem here too. So just a short story and then we'll be done. In 2001, right after 9/11, I was approached by the Bureau of Reclamation here in the United States, who manages a bunch of the dams in the West. And they said, I was working at NASA at the time, and they said, by the way, can you see small boats approaching our dams? Because they were very concerned about terrorist attacks on the large dams in the West. They still are. So when I worked for the Bureau of Reclamation about a decade later, I said, why aren't we sharing all of our reservoir data? And they said, it would make us easy targets for terrorists. It could be classified information to some extent. We don't want to share that information because it could make it more dangerous. And I said, you can just drive by the dam and look over and see how much water's in it. And they said, well, yeah, but if you're planning something, you might want to target a dam that's full, rather than one that's half empty. And so there's all kinds of reasons why data might not be shared. And one of them is you don't want your neighbors to know what you got, The terrorist is the same thing. I don't know how you solve that. Maybe some encryption, maybe some ways of processing the data so you can't really tell exactly, how much is stored in that reservoir, but you generally know, if you're in healthy water conditions or not, or, that kind of thing. So you're not sharing the details, but you're sharing some general things, some maybe value added, or a lot of times we'll assimilate data into a model, and we'll share the model results, but not the original data. And so it's a way to filter the data and not share the actual data, but kind of a model massaged product that comes out of it. And a lot of people feel more comfortable with that. So there might be a way to navigate that, but I think it's gonna take time and it's gonna take some care because people are very sensitive about these things, even here. Thank you for attending our panel.
Thank you, Dr. Hauser. Thank you to our speakers. Round of applause. So we're running just a couple of minutes late. I know we had other questions, including my question about dams and from Uganda. I'm thinking about we got the Euphrates being dammed in Turkey. We got the Mekong in China. We've got Ethiopia and the Nile, which creating problems for Sudan and Egypt. There will be a networking session. Hopefully, we'll continue the conversation. We're going to have a short break of 3 minutes, and then we'll get into the next panel session, and then we'll have our networking session following that panel session.